Quad66. Alright, here we go. We got some data from the T motor. This is the 1103 8000 kV motor. I thought this motor was interesting just because I think T motor has a pretty decent reputation for quality. But I shied away from it on the first go around because it's a heavy motor. It's a 5-gram motor, and for me, I think that's kind of outside of the weight that we want to be at for these kind of 2.5-inch props, low pitch, kind of easy to spin props. But the motor testing was requested, and so I thought I'd go through it. And as we did in the past, Carl Pablo did the actual thrust stand testing, including the static test and the step response. And I really appreciate he does a great job with that. And then I'm going to go through the results here. So going through the results, start right off with thrust testing. So this is pretty straightforward. One of the things to pay attention to here, though, is that in terms of thrust testing, we only go from 20 to 80% throttle. The reason for that is down here, this is kind of meaningless. Idle is usually down here. So we really want to know where the thrust starts once we're actually hovering, which is going to be typically 20% or higher. And then up high, the reason we cut it off is because Carl's smoked motors going up any higher, and so to keep it safe and get the motors through the testing, we've just kind of adapted the protocol of going up to 80%. So in this test, you can see we've got a real nice comparison of a lot of motors in here. Pretty much most of the 1103s, we've got some 1202s, and then there's a couple of ringer motors. Like we've got the Happy Model 1203 motor, and that's an 11,000 kV motor. Another ringer is still 1103, but it's the Mamba 1103 8500, so in terms of thrust testing. And then we also have this Apex 1202.6 motor, and it's 8,800 kV motor. And those are the top three on the thrust testing. The T motor is kind of interesting because in terms of the thrust, it starts out down here, not super impressive, kind of low on the thrust. But then, as you can see, as we go up to the higher thrust, it sort of like it kicks into gear and then it just keeps pulling. And I think that's my first indication here of like one of my suspicions is, so one of the comments, and I agree with this, is that the T motor, one of the advantages of having the heavy motor is that as long as they're not wasting the weight someplace else, then there's likely going to be more material in terms of heavy parts of the motor which produce the power, like the magnets, the iron in the stator, the copper windings, and things like that. And so this motor, whether either size-wise or just weight-wise of what they packed in, it's kind of behaving like a bigger motor, like a more powerful motor in that down low, it's just not spinning very easily because it's just the motor itself is kind of like it's a notchy. I haven't had these in my hands yet, but poor Carl Pablo, it's a pretty notchy motor. But then you can see as we get up into the higher thrust, it just gets into its own and starts pulling. When these other lighter motors start to struggle, the T motor really keeps going, and that's potentially an indication that this motor might even be a little bit under-propped, which would be a little bit surprising for the 1103. But anyways, the nice part about the T motor is you're going to have a nice range of power band. You're going to be able to go from, pretty low power to nice high thrust, and so that's good. So T motor looks pretty good there. Then we'll jump over to the efficiency, and this is where the picture isn't so great for the T motor. Especially down low, you can see the T motor is just really not doing well with efficiency. And the way this is calculated is the grams of thrust divided by, so it should be watts there, the watts of electrical power that's needed to spin the motor. And so down low, basically you're not getting a whole lot of thrust for the amount of power that you're putting into it. Things get better as we get up into the higher range. The motor moves from like one of the lower performing in terms of efficiency to, maybe not quite middle of the pack, but certainly not as bad. And that sort of fits with this story that maybe this motor is just a little bit under-propped, and so it's really not going to come into its own until you put on a prop that's going to challenge these other motors, where it's going to bog down the other motors, and the T motor might be a little bit happier with a higher pitch prop. Obviously that's a little bit speculative until we actually do it, but these two pieces of data kind of fit that way. So efficiency-wise, unfortunately, not a great story. So jumping into now some of the FPA analysis, or FPCA. What FPCA does is it takes that complicated, so these are complicated curves, right? This isn't just one data point, but in fact it's the amount of thrust is changing as a function of throttle percentage. And that's a complicated sort of piece of data to put together. And so what the functional principal component analysis does is it sees how do these motors differ from each other, and it defines those differences in terms of principal components. So in terms of thrust, it's pretty straightforward that there's basically one principal component, and you can see it's basically a gain function where there's not a lot of differences between the motors down low in terms of thrust, but the differences become bigger as they go higher. And most of the differences between these motors is explained in this first eigenfunction. So to describe the thrust, we really only need this one thing to simplify the whole thrust curve. In terms of how the T-motor does there then, what you can see is that the T-motor is really only falls short of some of these ringer motors, the Happy Model 1203, that Apex motor, and the Mamba. Otherwise, as far as the other 1103s goes, it's above most of those other 1103 or 1202 size motors. So thrust-wise, that's good. And if we brought in a second principal component to describe the sort of bias that's in here in terms of the T-motor does better up here, it might actually score a little bit higher if we use those two. Let's go ahead and zoom in on this little plot here. And by the way, I'm going to put all this data into a link below. It's going to be put on Google Sheets, so you can kind of parse through these numbers at your own pace. But giving you one more look here, where really this Happy model kind of skews everything, but otherwise, T-motor's pretty good there on thrust. So then when we go to efficiency, we need two components to explain efficiency. One is this kind of gain function, and you can see it's like sort of the opposite of thrust, where basically there's a lot of difference in these motors down low, and the difference decreases as we get up into the higher realms. But basically it's kind of an inverse gain function on efficiency. And then there's a second principal component of efficiency where there is sort of this twisting. So this is like a bias. Some motors that perform poorly down low or perform better as they get higher, and then other motors that perform well at lower throttle fall off as they go into the higher thrust. And so that second function, I'm saying it basically describes the bias in the motor, whether it's a low throttle bias motor or a high throttle bias motor. So in terms of how the T-motor does, unfortunately it's just not all that efficient of a motor. There are worse ones, I think, like this Flywoo. This LDA AC motor also doesn't do well. But in terms of most of the other motors that were, typically kind of the classic motor that we were used to is like this AMAX motor 1103. And some of the other interesting motors like the Gemfan RC 1202 8000 kV motor. The T motor is just below those. And even our Happy model ringer motor, this one had that crazy thrust. You can see that the T motor efficiency is even still lower than that Happy model motor. When we go to the bias, we can see here that the T motor is a high throttle bias motor, and that's kind of goes along with this idea that maybe this T motor could actually do better with a slightly higher pitched prop, and it just basically needs more to push on, and that's how maybe it'll do better. That could be true, could be, but I think it fits. But at the end of the day, we need to do some more thrust testing to parse that out. But that's not really my intent here. My intent here is to look at motors from the perspective that I'm building with, which is like using these Gemfan Tri-Blade 2512s or the HQ prop T65s and that type of prop. So that's the static test data. Now we go into the step responses. So the step responses, what we do is we take the motors and we start them at 10% throttle and we bump them up to 30% throttle. And then we look at the amount of time that it takes for them to get to, from one point to the next. And I didn't scale this. I think this, I forget exactly what this is. It's not seconds, because it's actually quicker than what a second and a half would imply. But because these motors basically kind of spin up pretty fast. But this first principal component, you can see that this is basically a gain function, that some motors will make a lesser step and then other motors will make a bigger step. And that's just kind of a function of like where they are in that throttle curve. Like, you know, are they kind of steep in the throttle curve down low, or are they a little bit less steep? And that's basically your gain function. So that one's important to consider, but I don't think that's the more interesting one. In terms of performance, I think that this is the more interesting one. So this is the second principal component. And it's not as dominant, but maybe it has more important implications in terms of motor performance. And so this one I call the lock-in. And so the lock-in is, so, you know, our motors kind of start in the same place. And they either accelerate very quickly and then plateau very quickly. And this is what we want. We want a motor that goes from whatever the previous command was up to our new throttle percentage, and we want it to lock in there super fast. Versus motors that we don't want. What we don't want is kind of them to respond kind of sluggishly and then take a long time, a real long time to kind of settle in. Because basically this motor that responds quickly and locks in, this one is responding to your PIDs and your commands very quickly, and it should theoretically make a quad that flies more precisely, handles prop better, and also is easier to tune theoretically. Motors that do this sluggish thing, well, those motors are likely to not tune as well or be quite as precise, because you can change things and they can't keep up with it. So if you change either your PID input or your stick input, it's just not going to be able to keep up with the changes that's demanded. So obviously kind of complicated data, and that's again where the FPCA makes a lot of sense, where you take that functional data and you simplify it down to just a couple of numbers. So how'd the T-motor response here? T-motor do here. So in terms of the gain function, T-motor was pretty good. So it makes a pretty big jump. I mean, I guess you could interpret that a couple of ways. You could interpret that, well, I don't want it to jump a lot because I want good resolution down low. Or you can say, well, I do want it to respond a lot because I want a motor that has a broad throttle range. So take that however you will. But anyways, T-motor, you can see that other than some of these kind of ringer motors, it's above the majority of them. The more important data point, I think, is probably how it locks in. And here it does really well. This is probably where this motor shines the best. You can see that other than, I think, the Brother Hobby motor, so this is, I'm really so sad that this motor's gone. So this is that 1103 8000 kV Brother Hobby motor. Most recently was available as an Avant motor rebranded. This was just like, so sad that this motor's gone. But anyways, the champ here I think is probably still going to be this Brother Hobby, or maybe the T motors. They're going to be really close. Basically these motors both lock in super well. And so this is that place where the T motor shines. And it's probably going to be, if the combination, that's probably going to be a function of the weight. Like if you've got good functional weight in there in terms of like a lot of weight in strong magnets, a lot of iron in your stator, a lot of copper in your windings, you really pack those windings in, then maybe that's part of why this can lock in really well. Also, to some degree, it might be a function of being under-propped. So for the motor, if the prop is kind of light and can sling it around real quick, it can potentially lock in really fast. But so that is one more piece that maybe suggests that this motor, maybe it's a little under-propped. Maybe it just needs a slightly higher pitch prop to really shine in terms of the thrust efficiency. But anyways, that's a good result there. So the last thing to do is go ahead and try and put some sense into where does this motor fall into things, and look at this from an overall perspective. So the way I summarize this data is on these radar charts. And the black motor is kind of our gold standard. So the black motor that I used here, this is that AMAX 1103 7500 kV. And I'm plotting on here just the T motor first, and we'll go through a couple different ones. And so it kind of went through, and lightness is the reverse of weight. So basically you get a negative score for weight. Thrust, pretty self-explanatory. Efficiency, and then we have that from our step functions, we have that gain function, and we have that lock function. So when I'm looking at this, you know, there's going to be some trade-offs here, obviously. You don't need, if you have more lightness, you don't need quite as much thrust. On the flip side, if you have more thrust, you can carry a little bit extra weight. And what we can see is that the AMAX motor, one of the things about it is a very balanced motor. This is not, I didn't scale this chart to the AMAX motor. This is like all the motors we had, and you can just see how the AMAX motor really just kind of fills in as a good all-arounder. It's got a decent weight, it's got good thrust, it's got good efficiency, it's got a pretty normal, typical step gain function, and it locks in pretty well. The T motor, on the other hand, is going to be a little bit different story. The weight, it's a heavy motor. It's a 5-gram motor. So you're adding at least a gram compared to most other motors that we're comparing to. Maybe a little bit less in some of them, like the Apex motor or the Happy Model 1203. But for the most 1103s, you're just a gram heavier per motor, and you multiply that by 4 for the 4 motors. That does make a difference. And you can see that there's a big difference in weight, and you get some more thrust out of it, but you don't get a ton more. And you give up efficiency too. So I think if you're taking a weight penalty and you're adding an efficiency penalty, this is really going to impact your flight time. Now, is it worth it to you individually? It might be, because if this really controls the prop, and especially I think if you want to go to a higher pitch prop, it might be the motor for you, because it can handle at least this prop, I think, very, very, very well. And so it might be easier to tune, it might feel more locked in, but it's, it's got its drawbacks. So comparing it to, let's do another comparison here. Sort of what I felt was the ideal motor, this Brother Hobby. So compared to the Brother Hobby motor, the Brother Hobby motor is a good bit lighter. I think it's like 1.5 grams lighter than the T motor. And what's kind of fascinating about it, though, is that although it's that much lighter, it actually matches the T motor. It gives up just a little bit of thrust, and then in terms of locking in, it's right there. It's right about the same, and it gives up just a little bit of the step gain. But it's better efficiency, and it's lighter. Yeah, it's probably going to be more fragile. That's probably true. But at the end of the day, I think it wasn't, I don't know, I wouldn't consider it like overly fragile. It didn't like fall apart the second you looked at it. And so this was a very nice performance envelope with the Brother Hobby motor, really just giving up a little bit of efficiency and not having a huge weight penalty. Fortunately, that Brother Hobby motor, it's not available, so maybe that kind of comparison is a little bit moot point. But I put it out there because maybe, if somebody gets inspired, if somebody's looking at this and saying, well, we can do better, I think we really, truly can. Now let's compare this to a couple of these ringer motors. Let's start with the Apex and see how that one looks. In some ways with the Apex motor, this is going to be a little bit more of a fair comparison. So what we see now is that the Apex motor is going to be a little bit lighter. It's not super light like some of the 1103s. It's 1202.6, so it is a little bit bigger motor. You get a little bit more thrust out of it, a little bit better efficiency, but you give up a little bit of that locking in. So that Apex motor is going to impress you more, when you jump into the throttle, because it's a little bit lower weight. It's got a little more thrust, and it's going to save, you're going to have some more flight time because it's lighter and it also has better efficiency. But it may not have the same prop control that T motor has. So I think this is kind of an interesting discussion in terms of which way, between these two motors, they're more similar, and it's a more interesting, kind of more fair comparison. And in some ways, if this is what you're after, the T motor might be the motor for you. Other motors, let's do 2 of them at the same time. Let's throw up the, let's do the Mamba and the Happy Model motor. Well, that's going to be confusing because I'm going to change colors. Let's keep it the same color for you. All right, so let's do the Mamba first. All right, so another kind of, I think, interesting comparison here too, and this is kind of like the Apex motor, where with the Mamba motor, it's a heavy motor, not quite as heavy as the T motor, has better thrust than the T motor, similar efficiency, but then it gives up the lock, that kind of locking in function. And so it's kind of interesting, if you're all out kind of performance in terms of hitting the throttle, see what happens. I think that Mamba motor would do better. On the other hand, maybe if you're tuning and if you're looking for real precise handling, that T motor might be a little bit better. Okay, last comparison. So now we've got the Happy model. So that's a 1203 11,000 kV motor. Comparing that to our T motor, 1103 motor. So now that we throw up a real ringer motor on here, the T motor kind of makes it makes the T motor look a little bit more humble. So in some ways, so these are both heavy motors, and kind of in that 5 gram range. The Happy model is a little bit lighter, but not noticeably more. But with the Happy model, although it's a little bit lighter, but in the same weight class, but you do get a bigger motor in terms of 1203, at least on paper, is what they're saying. And with that, you do also gain a little bit of efficiency, yet more thrust, without giving up that ability to lock in, which to me is kind of the interesting part, because sometimes you think it's like, okay, are you just making thrust because you're finding that nice balance when you're letting the motor spin easily enough, and have enough to push that prop, but is it doing something else, giving up, something somewhere else? And so this is one more of those to kind of include, to say, well, I think, with the motors that are available, we can do better. So if we're going to go ahead and put more weight into the motor, we can actually potentially get it to perform better. We can get more thrust out of it. We can get a little bit more efficiency, or if we were to bring this KV down a little bit, we'd probably gain quite a bit more efficiency. And so we can certainly, I think, match the thrust and not give up really much of anything on how well it locks in. So how well is it going to control that prop and be able to tune? Now, really and truly, the Happy model, I think, is a bit of a cheater. I think it is a little bit more fragile of a motor. And so this lightness, is not fair, but it is lighter. So maybe if you add enough material to get it to the same sort of durability, it's probably not going to be, maybe it brings it in line with the T motor. But I thought that was kind of an interesting comparison to finish on. So, overall, what do we say about this T motor? Overall conclusions. Overall, I think for this class of prop, I think the weight is a factor, and I think it may be too much of a factor. I was kind of curious, honestly, how this motor, it locks in so well. I was kind of thinking about ordering a set when I saw these results. But then when I go back through it and I'm like, well, it's going to be heavy, it's not efficient, and it's got good but not great thrust. I don't think that this thrust is going to be enough to make up for the weight, and with the efficiency not being good either. If the efficiency was good, then maybe it would do okay. But if you're giving up both flight time and you're not going to have, I think, maybe the thrust will be impressive, but I don't think it's going to be that impressive once you're carrying around that extra weight to justify it. So for me, I think interesting motor. I am curious to test it, but I don't know if I'm curious enough to spend the 50 or 60 bucks on it. Okay, so I'll throw the data into some spreadsheets and share those Google files. Links will be down below. Until next time, cheers.